Welcome to this explainer. What if I told you that back in the 19th century, people weren't actually terrified of dying? No, they were terrified of something infinitely worse. They were absolutely terrified of waking up inside their own grave. During the Victorian era, this creeping, suffocating anxiety just spread like wildfire across Europe and America. It was this intense primal fear, and it was so widespread that it literally spawned an entire industry of macabre, desperate inventions, and all of them were designed for one purpose: to save people from the ultimate claustrophobic nightmare of being buried alive. So today, we're diving into this incredibly dark, fascinating chapter of history. I want you to literally put yourself in this impossible, terrifying situation for just a second. Picture this. You open your eyes, and it is completely suffocatingly pitch black. The air is immediately thin, it's heavy, and it smells faintly of damp pine and cold earth. You try to sit up, right? But your forehead instantly hits a solid wooden board, just inches above your nose. You reach out, your knuckles scraping against these tight, unyielding walls. You push, you shove, you scream for help, but there's 6 feet of heavy, compacted dirt pressing down on top of you, just absorbing every single sound you make. For the Victorians, this wasn't just some plot from a Gothic horror novel. This was a genuine, visceral terror they carried with them every single day. So you have to ask yourself, why was this fear so out of control? Well, you've got to look at the grim reality of 1800s medicine. It was an era of just deep, unsettling uncertainty. Doctors back then simply had no reliable way to confirm if someone was actually dead. I mean, there were no EEG machines to measure brain waves. There was zero modern pulse monitoring. In fact, a lot of times, the medical community couldn't even agree on what the undeniable biological signs of death actually looked like. Was a really shallow, barely there breath considered death? What about a super weak pulse that a doctor's crude instruments just missed? This complete lack of reliable medical technology created the absolute perfect breeding ground for mass, terrifying anxiety. It actually has a clinical name: Taphephobia. It comes from the Greek words for grave and fear, and it's defined as the extreme and irrational fear of being buried alive. But here's the thing. For the Victorians, it didn't feel irrational in the slightest. You have this stark, clinical definition, but it's totally clashing with the psychological terror being fueled daily by horrific stories in the newspapers. The media absolutely loved splashing these sensationalized accounts across their pages, stories of people waking up during their own funerals, or, far worse, being discovered in the earth way, way too late. And what really accelerated this panic to a total fever pitch were disease outbreaks. Cholera epidemics were ravaging communities, and they turned this underlying fear into an absolute living nightmare. See, cholera victims would sometimes slip into these incredibly deep comas. Their heart rates would just plummet, their breathing became virtually undetectable, and their skin would go ice cold. They could look completely dead for hours or even days. And in the chaotic, panicked rush to stop the disease from spreading through these towns, bodies were hurriedly shoved into the earth. Sometimes, tragically, they were rushed into the dark entirely too quickly because nobody could be absolutely sure who was truly gone. That horrific uncertainty led to some incredibly chilling discoveries. Across Europe, these deeply disturbing accounts started circulating from families who, for one reason or another, had to exhume the graves of their loved ones weeks or months later. And what they reported finding? It is the stuff of pure nightmares. They claimed to find deep scratch marks clawed right into the inside of wooden coffin lids, fingers with torn, bloody nails, clothing that was violently disturbed, and bodies twisted into these unnatural positions, as if the person had woken up in the suffocating dark and fought a terrifying, losing battle to escape. Now, whether these stories were entirely true, misinterpretations of natural bodily decay, or just wild exaggerations, it didn't matter. The psychological impact on society was devastating. Section 1. The Safety Coffin, Desperate Inventions. Out of this overwhelming, paralyzing fear, an entirely new branch of engineering was born, because human beings will always try to invent their way out of a problem, right? Even if that problem is waiting for them 6 feet under. Inventors started creating these elaborate, desperate burial systems designed purely to detect life underground. Take one of the most famous designs, the Bates and Revival Bell system. They built coffins with actual breathing tubes that reached all the way up to the surface so you wouldn't suffocate. Some even had glass windows installed right over the face so cemetery workers could look down and check for condensation from breath. There were even designs with pipes meant to drop food and water down to the trapped person. But the most famous feature by far? Pull cords. Cords placed inside the coffin, running right into the hands of the deceased and connected directly to a brass bell mounted on the gravestone above. The desperate hope was incredibly simple. Wake up, pull the cord, ring the bell, and pray to God someone hears you.
But as universal and primal as this fear was, escaping the grave was definitely not a universal right. These safety coffins and elaborate bell systems were insanely expensive. They required custom engineering, extra materials, and specialized cemetery plots. Because of that, they were almost exclusively bought by very wealthy families. It basically turned burial security into this macabre luxury insurance policy. So even in the face of death, in this universal terror of the dark, strict class divisions were firmly in place. The rich could afford the hope of a bell, the poor were simply put in the dirt. Section 2. The Graveyard Watch. Now, a bell above a grave is completely useless if there's no one around to actually hear it ring. To solve that little problem, cemeteries started hiring night watchmen specifically for this chilling task. Just imagine their job for a second. Step 1. Patrol a sprawling, shadowed graveyard in the dead of night in absolute creeping silence. Step 2. Wait. Just wait for a sound that might never come, but could theoretically shatter the silence at any agonizing moment. And step 3, deal with the constant grinding psychological strain of false alarms. Because as the soil naturally settled over a fresh grave, the coffin would shift. Animals digging nearby could disturb the taut ropes. Even heavy wind and rain could rattle that brass. Just imagine standing completely alone over a fresh grave at 2 a.m. It's just you and the damp earth. A cold wind blows through the trees, and suddenly, very faintly, a bell rings. You just freeze. Was it a heavy branch falling? Did the earth just shift? Or is there a living, breathing human being right beneath your boots, wide awake, eyes wide in the pitch black, desperately pulling a cord and screaming into the wood? And the really agonizing truth? By the time the strict protocols for exhumation were followed, by the time authorities were fetched and shovels actually hit the dirt, it would almost certainly be too late anyway. Section 3. The Stark Reality. All right, now we need to transition from all this atmospheric dread to the cold, clinical truth of the matter. You've probably heard people confidently claim that common everyday phrases come from this terrifying era, but historically, that's completely inaccurate. The myth that the phrase "saved by the bell" comes from these safety coffins, the reality is it originates from the sport of boxing, when a fighter is saved from a knockout count because the round ends. The myth that working the graveyard shift literally meant listening for coffin bells, the reality is it's just an old term for standard late-night working hours. And the absolute biggest myth of all, that these bells actually saved lives. The harsh, documented reality is that historians have found absolutely zero verified cases in all of history of a person ever being rescued by a coffin bell system. Not a single one. Because these elaborate machines, the tubes, the cords, the bells, they were built entirely on a foundation of pure psychological fear, not biological science. If someone genuinely woke up trapped inside a sealed, buried coffin, the sheer, unimaginable panic would cause their heart rate to spike instantly. Their lungs would be aggressively clawing for what tiny bit of oxygen was left in that dark box, and they'd use it up in a matter of minutes. Oxygen deprivation would overwhelm them long before a night watchman could hear a bell, set a crew, and dig through 6 feet of heavy, compacted dirt. Survival was, medically speaking, completely impossible. Today, thankfully, technology has erased the vast majority of those terrible Victorian uncertainties. Modern medical diagnostics confirm death with a precision that would have literally been unimaginable back in the 1800s. And yet, this explainer wouldn't really be complete without recognizing how all of this connects back to us today. Because while we definitely don't rig our gravestones with brass bells anymore, that core fascination hasn't entirely disappeared. Modern concepts like digital afterlife monitoring or really specific green burial requests, they reflect our continuing deep-seated desire to control exactly what happens to us after death. It proves that, much like the Victorians, we still grapple with that lingering fear of not being fully gone or not being properly handled at the very end. There's a really profound truth to take away from all this. Some inventions don't reveal what we can do, they reveal what we're afraid of. The Bates and Revival bell was absolutely not a triumph of medical rescue technology. It was a monument to human terror. It was the physical evidence of a society that was so deeply afraid of the dark and so deeply mistrustful of their own understanding of life and death that they went and engineered traps for ghosts. The Victorian era eventually moved on, medicine advanced, and the bells were slowly removed from the cemeteries, just rusting away into history. But that psychological weight, that remains. Because even now, with all our modern science and technology, there is still an existential chill that runs right down your spine when you imagine it. A silent graveyard, a cold night, and the terrifying thought of what you would do if you heard a bell ring right beneath your feet.